Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Marty Exline with AT3 Center, or good morning for some of you. We want to welcome you to Accessibility and Web-Based Multimedia. And obviously, accessibility for the web is very important, especially in these days of COVID, where people are accessing the web more and more, including audio and visual multimedia. From ordering groceries to applying for to get vaccination. I mean, it's ubiquitous, and it's more important than ever that the web be accessible for people with disabilities. Let's move to the next slide. And our presenter today, of course, is Rob Carr with the Oklahoma Able Tech. And just a couple of reminders, of course, to see the captions, just click on the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you do have questions or comments, please go ahead and enter them in the chat window, and we'll monitor those as we go along. Make sure you look at the AT3 website for upcoming events, and we'll also be posting information about ICT webinars, both on the AT3 listserv and on the ICT Accessibility Community of Practice listserv. Also, you will be receiving a webinar survey soon, probably tomorrow or in the next couple of days. When you do, please make sure you fill it out and let us know what you thought of the webinar, if there's other information down the road that you think would be helpful to you. And I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Rob.
Fantastic, Marty. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here for our live broadcast of this webinar today. As Marty said, my name is Rob Carr. I am Accessibility Program Manager for Oklahoma Able Tech. We are the Technology Act the Assistive Technology Act program for the state of Oklahoma. Great to see so many familiar names in our lists. I know all of us would prefer to be in person for some things, and along those same lines, thank you for joining us again on Zoom. I think everyone does indeed have Zoom fatigue. We're going to start out today with just some concepts, and I'll give you an idea of what we're going to discuss, what I'm going to talk through. First, we'll just talk about some of the fundamental concepts of making these kinds of interactions, as well as recorded audio and video, more accessible for people with disabilities. And then I'm going to talk halfway or a little bit past halfway through our time together today about some of the techniques and tools that you can use specifically to create good captions or transcripts for your multimedia. So we'll begin by looking high level and then get into some of the how-to as we move forward. Like Marty said, feel free to pop questions into the chat. Lissa Prince, who works with me at Able Tech, will be helping me monitor there, and we'll try to get those answered. And just be warned that I'm not afraid to say I don't know if I don't know the answer to a question. So the idea with accessibility in audio and video online, and this is true generally speaking as well, is that we're trying to make sure that we provide the same use of the same thing for as many people as possible, ideally for everyone. When we talk about multimedia in particular, we've got a few things that stand out. And the first is probably what most people first think about or most commonly think about, and that's transcription or captioning. And like Marty said, you can turn on captions for this broadcast directly through Zoom. We'll talk about some of the other methods that captions can be delivered. That's probably the thing that pops to mind first. But we'll also talk about audio description, what that means. I'll demonstrate, I'll show a couple of approaches to audio description. Talk a little bit about sign language interpretation as well, and how critical it can be to provide. And then we'll touch on platform and player accessibility. And what I mean by that is, if you have an embedded player in your website where someone can go in and there's a play button that becomes pause after you play, and there are volume controls and things like that, there are accessibility considerations with those as well. We won't get really, really deep into that, but I'll tell you why not when we get to that point in our time together today. So a transcript is the exact text that's spoken by someone. A transcript is first and foremost accurate, and that's accurate in terms of providing things like speaker identification when you have more than one speaker. Also including some notes about important action that might take place that's audible. So if there is a background noise that is meaningful to what's going on, then you typically see that in your transcript. This is the most intensive part of creating either a transcript or going on to create a caption file and to create captions. And I'll talk about the difference between those two here in just a couple of minutes and show you a couple of the files so you can actually see that difference. And I'll describe that a little bit as well. When we think about accessibility, a transcript is what we need to provide that equal access, to provide that as equivalent of an experience as we can when we have an audio only broadcast. So if you think about a podcast, or something that streams on a radio network, for example, if they publish that online, then it needs to have a text transcript. So a transcript, and I'll stop sharing this. Well, actually, no, I'll just move over. I'll continue to share. And I will just ask for someone to confirm with me. Can you all now see just a text file? Could somebody just confirm in the chat real quick? I want to be sure that the share is working. John, thank you. So this is a transcript file. This is rendered in Word, and it's pretty straightforward. With this one, this is actually a webinar that Lissa and I did a while back. The text is not as important in this case. This is really just to show you what a transcript file looks like, and that is paragraphs and text. It does have speaker identification because there were two of us who were actually presenting it. And the speaker identification in this first paragraph, it begins with my name in all caps because I led the webinar off. When it transitions over to Lissa, it's her name, Lissa Prince, in all caps. And that is just to show that we've got not only different speakers, but to show who those speakers actually are, to let people know that someone else is coming in and talking, and here's who that person is. Text transcripts are generally going to look like this. They're going to be text-based. They might be in Word, they might be a PDF, they may be a separate web page, for example, as well. The important thing is that the text is there and available. And let me check. I don't have the Q&A panel on me. Kate, you asked about who do we use for live captioning. I'll actually route that real quickly while there's a bit of a transition here to the folks at AT3, because I know who we use and I'll answer that, but AT3 can answer as well.
We use AI Media. They were also formerly called ACS.
And Kate, we use a local group that's local to us here in Oklahoma called Young Reporting Services. They've done live captioning at our in-person conference over the years, and they also do captioning through the various multimedia platforms that are out there now. So to move on then to captions. Basically, captions are transcript plus timing. And the timing is important, and the distinction between these two is really in the media that we're delivering. When you talk about a transcript, you're talking about audio only. In an audio only broadcast, there's no need to make sure that you synchronize the words that appear in the transcript with on-screen events, because with audio only, there's nothing happening on screen visually. Captions do need to be synchronized with what's happening on screen. So as a video moves through on YouTube or on your television set, the captions need to be synchronized so that everything matches up time-wise, right? And so captions are fundamentally the transcript that I just showed you plus timing information. Ideally, they're separate from your video track. Ideally, your caption file is a separate file, and that's actually what gives people the ability to turn the captions on or off, which I'll talk about more here in just a couple of minutes. Again, your spoken content, speaker identification, important sounds, the content of the captions is going to be really, really similar to what's in your transcript, in that you're trying to convey the audible and auditory information through the caption track. The biggest difference is that the file in and of itself is very different. So I'm going to show you and describe a caption file real quickly. There are several different versions of caption files that the different video platforms will support. Make that a little bit bigger. So what we see is some really familiar content from that transcript, in that it has my name, Rob Carr, and it has the first thing I said in this particular webinar, which is we will get started here in just a little bit under 5 minutes. The difference is that we've got extra information here. So we have information that breaks down to a really, really fine level when the captions need to appear and when they need to disappear. So there's a line in every caption file format that shows the time, and the time is relative to the video playback, right? So if you think of 0 as where the video starts, this one comes in, it looks like at 1 second, 159 thousandths of a second, and then it goes to just a little bit past 2 1/4 seconds for the first 2 lines. The other thing that's different in this format is you don't see traditional paragraphs like you do in a transcript file. And that's because captions are usually shown anywhere between 1 and 3 lines at a time. It's pretty common to see 2 or 3 lines, and that's all defined by this caption file. So again, this is a separate file that exists away from your video. And that's what really does give us the opportunity, like I said, to, let me get back to PowerPoint. That's what gives us the opportunity to turn the captions off or on. And there's an important distinction here. We have open captions and we have closed captions. I think that just the way we talk about captions, we almost always hear or read closed captions, but there's actually a difference between closed and open. Closed captions are what I just talked through, where you have a separate audio and video file. They can be turned on and off. And the caption file itself becomes a file that can be searchable and indexed by searches. The caption file is something then that in some platforms will let you actually search the text for a particular word or phrase. And some platforms will, based on what it finds, take you right to that spot in the video. So these things are all possible because we have this separate text file. Open captions are burned into the video. They are embedded into the video itself. So they're not a separate file. And that means that you can't turn them on, you can't turn them off, right? Or you can't turn them off. They're always there. They're always visible. With open captions, this is my opinion, but it is backed by some research, and it kind of comes back to universal design, which you can think of as a broader umbrella under which accessibility sits. And that is that really the only time you should use open captions is when a video platform or a content platform doesn't support closed captions. There are still some out there, and particularly in social media, you have to watch for platforms and their support or lack of support for true closed captions. You can create open captions. In other words, you can burn your captions onto the video using any of a number of video editing software tools that are out there. So tools like Adobe Premiere or Camtasia will let you create open captions. Sometimes they're the only way you can get a caption track into a video. Sometimes there is no other way. But again, when you have the option, we suggest that you give the option to the people who are actually consuming the video content and make sure that the closed captions are there so they can have them on or off. So I'll move to audio description. So we're moving away from the concept of taking what is audible and converting it into text. And now we're taking what's visual and converting it into speech. We're describing the important visual aspects of a video. This is for folks who can't see the video in particular, right? If someone can't see a video, they can hear it. They're only getting the audible information. So audio description exists to describe important visual elements. If you're familiar with web accessibility in general, this is basically alternative text, but for a video. So it's very dynamic. Most of the time, it is another separate video or a separate track from the video itself. So again, people can turn it on or turn it off. If you are a Netflix subscriber, I think Amazon Prime might have this as well. I know a lot of the big streaming content providers have been bringing more audio description into their offerings of late. And it's a toggle. You can turn it on or you can turn it off, just like with your captions. Audio description by our standards is something that is required for pre-recorded content. So if you work in an organization where specific web accessibility standards apply, it is actually a requirement for things that you have pre-recorded. In other words, not for something that's live. It's still outrageously important, whether you are governed by the standards or not, to provide this accessibility, to make sure, again, that that interaction is as much the same as it can be for someone who can't see the screen or can't see it well. And there are several techniques that we can use to basically embed the audio description into just the regular script, the regular narrative. I'm going to show, and I should have sound checked. We'll find out if the sound from my browser comes through or not. If it doesn't, we can fix that really quickly. We have colleagues in Canada at the, what is AMI? What they have done some really good work and have some great examples of what they call integrated described video. And this is where they embed the audio description into the actual script. I'm not going to play a ton of this, and I will go to full size here in a moment, but I just want you to see and hear the difference, and particularly hear the difference in the way the audio description is provided with these two videos. Is the audio coming through for you all? Okay, let me pause it. Just one moment. Let me back out real quick. Yes, Amy, I'll put the link in real quick as well. Let me see if this has it going.
At the wheel. So I'm going to show you what you're going to do.
He slaps a ball of clay on the wheel.
We've pushed this on there. It's
Okay,
stuck
very good.
on now.
Sorry about that. Should have checked before we
stop it from wobbling.
went, but
okay.
again,
So
just
nice
listen
fast
to
wheel
the
speed,
difference.
And I'm going to
Well,
cut my
listen to this
hands,
first, and then you'll
put
hear
them
the
on top
difference
He
here
squeezes the
in
clay
just a
into
moment.
a cone and pushes it down.
Once you've got this done properly, you'll feel this moment of stillness in your hands. And then
It's actually,
it's not
Kate, it's
wobbling
really
anymore.
okay if you're not hearing
Now,
it or if
what
you're
gonna
not
need to
seeing
do
it.
is you're going to take your
I'll
finger,
Okay.
kick
and
my
you're
share
going to
back
start pressing
on.
with that fingertip.
He pokes the center of the clay.
Now it's time to pull this open, so here we go.
With his finger, he widens the hole in the middle.
There we go. That's far enough.
Okay.
And then I'm pinching with those two fingers, and up we come.
Pinching, he pulls the clay up.
So this is example one. We'll go to example two, which is very much the same video, but at the same time, it's very different
Hi, I'm
in
Kelly
the way
Ray
that it
with
presents
Show
the
Me Your
content.
Art. Twitter @KellyArt, hashtag Show Me Your Art. Today, I am getting pottery trained. Let's go. Wow, what a cute studio.
So, all right, never mind.
And then once you get your apron here, We're gonna get you over at the wheel. Here
This
we
is
go. I'm
this
gonna
is
show
about
you
the
first
same
how
point
to
where the
make a
video
art.
was running
I'm gonna
before.
take my piece of clay in my hand here. I'm gonna bang that on that wheel really well.
Okay.
So let's get the wheel turned
So
on.
really,
The first thing I'm
what
gonna do
they're
is I'm
doing
gonna
is,
pull with my
as they
right hand
do
and push with
something
my
that
left
is
hand.
visually
And I'm
meaningful,
crushing the
instead of
clay,
having a
and
separate
it comes right up to the middle of
description
my
come
hands.
through in
See
a
how it's
separate
forming a
audio
cone
track,
there?
Yes.
And I tip it
they're
over and I'm pushing
working
it
it
down
all
into
into
the
their
bottom
script.
of my right hand.
Okay.
And the clay now is gonna stop.
So this is actually a technique I know that we use pretty commonly, especially when we're doing training. When we are working people through how-tos about, say, Word or PowerPoint or web accessibility testing, we describe what we're doing as we're doing it. So we're showing both visually, but we're also telling people what we're doing just in the flow of the script that we have. And that's what this is an example of as well, just done at a professional level, where the entire production dedicated themselves to making sure that these visually important elements were described. And it's more seamless, it's less choppy. One of the tricky parts with audio description as well is that it becomes a little bit of an art. You have to decide not only what is important enough to describe, but how do you get a good description in the time that you have. And sometimes if you're doing this in post-production, you actually need to pause the video playback itself to allow enough time for the audio description. So that changes that experience a little bit. One thing that I think is fantastic about this approach, about working to integrate the audio description into the script, is that you don't have to worry about anything like that. It might add a little bit of volume, but it goes ahead and takes care of this requirement for audio description, and it does it in a way that is pretty elegant. And as I said, for those of you who do trainings, it's a really good habit to be in just in general. You know, if you have a visual on screen, a chart or a graph, something like that, it's a really, really good idea to be in the habit of describing that, so that people who can't see, or even people who have 5 Zooms going at once and they draw the short straw and have to turn off their video for some reason, if you're describing what's going on, they're going to have a much better chance of understanding your meaning. So questions on audio description there. I apologize for the glitch and just didn't think to test it before we got on, but I hope you heard the difference between those two approaches and can start to think a little bit about the things that you control in particular. John asked if we tried a new service from Spectrum Cable that uses a free app for description. I have not. We actually are not Spectrum Cable served, but I have not. Eileen indicates that yes, that it was, or it was enough. So that's interesting. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the automated and app-based stuff, particularly in the context of captions here in a little bit. So back to captioning, but in a different setting, a setting like this one where we're live. Obviously it's live, that's why the demo didn't work. But live captioning is something that is by standards, again, a requirement. So audio description is only needed for post-production work or things that you put out after they have been recorded live. Captioning is a requirement for live events, usually something that's vendor provided. And those vendors can either be human or they can be robots. They can be computer systems that are trying to create the captions automatically. Captioning is typically done remotely. You don't have to have anybody in a room. It's all done through the magic of the internet, but it does need platform support. So what I mean by that is Zoom and Teams and most of the web conferencing platforms that now we live in and have lived in for almost a year, most of them support captions straight through the platform. So in Zoom, you can hit the CC button and it will display the captions right there for you in the Zoom panel. Sometimes that's not possible. Some platforms still don't support streaming captions through them, but there are alternatives. Products like StreamText allow the captions to be sent through the platform itself if it supports it, but also out to a web browser. So with StreamText, you would put a web address, say, in the chat and send people to that website, and it will actually show the captions coming up in real time. Now they look more like a transcript. They just come up in the web browser. So they look more like a transcript, but they do come up pretty quickly. You know, if your caption service is sending them out and there aren't any glitches, they come up pretty well in time. So It's a matter of preference and need often, whether or not you should provide stream text in addition to the platform captions. I know at the ATIA conference that many of you might have participated in over a couple of weeks here recently, they offered both. So they had captions going through Zoom and also had stream text up and available as well. But keep in mind that stream text exists if you're streaming through a platform that doesn't allow you to actually push closed captions out through it. I want to talk a bit about automatic captioning. I think especially since our meetings are all, well, I don't want to say all, so many of our meetings are remote. So many of our presentations, our trainings, our workshops, we're doing so much more remotely now that we weren't doing remotely before. The automatic captioning conversation, from what I have seen just anecdotally and observationally, has changed a little bit. Number one, automatic solutions are becoming used more often. I think anybody would say that human captions are still going to be more accurate than the automatic captions. But in a situation like a meeting, where you have many, many meetings up through the course of a week, and where you're on Zoom or Teams or whatever all the time, it can get almost impossible to afford paying the rate for live human captions. It can get really, really expensive. So I think especially in the context of meetings, more and more people are relying on some of the automated solutions. These are four that we're not endorsing. We just see them a lot. The first one that's a standalone tool is otter.ai that does have integrations with some different platforms. We've got a link, and Lissa can put these links into the chat for everybody as well. We've got a link to the notes from Microsoft about how to turn on transcription in PowerPoint, which it supports now natively if you're on Office 365 or 2019. You've got the same feature in Microsoft Teams, and Zoom now has automated captions as well. So for things like meetings, again, I think that it may be about the only way to realistically provide captions. It's still not likely to be as accurate as a human being. So I think for most organizations, there's a practical point at which they can't afford necessarily to pay a live captioner. I wouldn't necessarily rely on automated captioning for a large training, for a statewide or regional or national event. It's always going to be more accurate to have a human being providing it. Amy asked, do we know why Microsoft Transcript would not show up for the audience? I can't get that specific right now, but that's something that if you want to reach out after, then, or maybe send me your email, we could follow up and try to troubleshoot, because I don't know of anything generally that would cause that. So accuracy is the key to providing captions. People ask, well, what percentage of accuracy is enough? And from what I've read, when you get to and over about 3% error rate, content gets really difficult to understand. It really takes away from your meaning. So 97 is a minimum, but realistically speaking, from a practical perspective, 99+% is what's required. That's not required in any standards. We don't actually see anything in our standards that specifies an accuracy rate. Again, practically speaking, 99+ is really required. And that 97% is probably pushing it. And remember to include acronyms, abbreviations, punctuation, capitalization in that accuracy calculation. It isn't just misspelled words. It's making sure that those acronyms are actually spelled correctly. This is the area, or these are the areas where the automated solutions can get tripped up, especially if you're in kind of a niche sort of topic. The acronyms and punctuation, they mess up pretty regularly. We see punctuation not work very well, which leads to problems with capitalization, which all really takes away from the ability for people to actually comprehend what the caption track says. Yeah, and Angela mentions that the just-in-time kind of solution that they've used was to turn on live transcribe on the Google phone, which listened and then it spits it out. So there are ways that you can do this on the fly. I do like that Microsoft, in PowerPoint at least, has the automatic transcripts, they're just as a button that you hit and it kicks them off. So inaccurate captioning, a couple of other thoughts there. And I think about this first point as one that comes up in my mind, at least, when someone has like a promotional video, for example, or a 5 or 10 minute video from the president of the organization. When the captions are provided automatically and there are errors, to me, it seems a little bit unprofessional. And that's strictly a marketing kind of concern. But for those short little videos, the other piece that carries my train of thought forward on this is that it's not that difficult to either have somebody do it internally for a 5 or 10 minute video, or to send it out. You know, it's not very expensive for a short video to send it out, have somebody else do the captioning, or just do the transcript and send that back. And then you can handle the timing, which we'll again talk about here a little bit later. The biggest thing is that it takes away meaning from a lot of your audience. The amount of video and the circumstances that we're in now when we consume video, it's just very different, right? I mean, I said 5 Zooms at once. We've had weather lockdown for the last week, but when we have had lockdown from the pandemic, we would have, as many of you have dealt with, 4+ sessions on some video platform going at once. And the captions can become important when there are problems with audio, when there are technical difficulties. You're taking information away from a lot of your audience. And fundamentally, and in the context of civil rights and accessibility, it's discriminatory against the deaf or hard of hearing audience members because they're not getting anything like equal access at all. Tori points out Rev captioning is only $1.25 a minute. One of the things that I'll say, not specific to Rev, but about the captioning service providers is, in some organizations, you're going to want to look at their terms of service. You're going to want to make sure that the privacy policy that they have is adequate for your organization. Something to keep in mind with the services, Rev crowdsources captioning, which means that they have a pool of people who provide captioning for them. And it's a different model than what a 3Play or ACS might do with their caption folks. So that's just something to think about. Some organizations will want to take a look at a privacy policy. There's a comment that Word 365's transcribe will get about 90% there, and you'll use it to draft a transcript of recorded announcements and then have somebody go through and correct. And that's a point that I will make later on, but it's a good time to make it now. Even if your automatic solution provides you with a transcript or a caption file that isn't perfect, it gives you a place to start, and you can go in and edit. And I'll talk through that real briefly when we get to the piece about how to do captions here in a few minutes. There are free and paid tools out there that make it relatively easy to do correction, but it's still certainly possible. So I'll move on and talk talk here for a few minutes about sign language interpretation. So sign language interpretation is something that we've all seen. Some of you might have seen the flap about it once the last administration, near its end, finally began to have an ASL, or American Sign Language interpreter, for their press briefings and such. But this is a human being who joins into your virtual event and provides interpretation into sign language. There are some considerations with this, because more often than not, providing a sign language interpreter is not as much the way that we do things, right? It's not something like captions that we might think about. And I think some of that falls out of the fact that sign interpretation is not currently a requirement under accessibility standards. So if you look to conform to accessibility standards, it's not something that is required. But since we went all virtual a year ago, the prices have come down, availability has come up, and the considerations have changed a little bit about when we proactively provide American Sign Language interpreting. Typically, up to the pandemic and even into this pandemic, most organizations will rely on an accommodations request. However, if it's an important enough message, in other words, if it is a health update, a pandemic or vaccine update at the state and local level, what we're seeing more and more is that there is a sign interpreter there providing interpretation, right? So with the more important and critical communications that are coming out through video, through web-based video, the inclusion of interpretation is becoming more common. Sometimes people will weigh into their decision the size of the audience. The bigger your audience, the more likely it will be that somebody needs ASL interpretation. And I mentioned accommodations. This is often the way that organizations end up deciding where to include ASL interpretation or sign interpretation, and that is to ask for accommodations upfront at registration for an event. It's a really, really good idea no matter what, for your meetings, for any kind of conferences, and this is true whether they're in person or remote. You know, maybe in the next several months we'll do more in person again, and the same considerations will likely apply. And one thing to keep in mind with Sign in the video platforms is Google your video platform and find out how to make sure that you can keep the video for the interpreter up the whole time. So in Zoom, for example, you can spotlight one or more video feeds, which is great. It used to just be one, but now you can have one or more video feeds with a spotlight on them. And what that does is it keeps that video up, even if someone changes their screen share, for example. So it keeps that video up so that the ASL interpretation is consistent throughout, and it's also in recordings that way. I'm just looking at a couple of comments in the chat. And I'm going to follow up, Lisa, on your comment about accuracy for speakers who talk fairly slowly and clearly, et cetera. That is one of the areas where the automatic tools do struggle a little bit, especially with accents. The closed caption option in PowerPoint, I run the speaker view, and so I kind of know one way to turn it on. But when you have the speaker view, in that speaker view pane, there's a little button. I'm sure it's in the ribbon somewhere as well. An important thing to keep in mind, and I think a misconception for some folks, captioning is not interpreting. The two are not equivalent. Written language is different from sign language, right? So providing captions is not the same as providing ASL. So if you ask for accommodations requests and someone requests an ASL interpreter, don't come back and say, hey, we're providing captions, you'll be fine, because they may not be fine. Now, some folks know both. Some folks can read written and know ASL, but not everybody. And especially with accommodations, if you're in the public sector, you really need to go with the thing that is most effective for the human being that's asking for it. They're probably not asking for it just to get you to pay another bill. They're asking because they want to get, again, that equivalent experience in engaging with your content, and you want to provide that. So just remember that one of these is not equivalent to the other, and it goes both ways. And that might be a better way to think of it. For those of us that don't know ASL, if someone provided ASL interpretation and we needed captioning, not at all the same, right? So keep that in mind if you rely on accommodations requests, not to combine the two into one. They are very, very different. So a quick note about embedded players. Again, these are the little widgets that sit in your website, and they'll play your audio track, they'll play your video. Those need to be accessible in kind of the broader web accessibility context. So for example, all the controls need to be reachable and usable just from a keyboard. So you can't have an interaction that relies on the use of a mouse. You need to be sure that controls are announced properly by screen readers. So not only are they reachable by a keyboard for anybody, but if a screen reader user navigates by a keyboard to that, will the screen reader announce what the control actually does? Or will it announce the state of the control? You know, if a pause button turns to a play button when you toggle it, the screen reader user needs to know that, so they know what state that is in. You need to be sure that you can tell where you are if you're navigating by a keyboard only. So you need a visual focus indicator. Good visual design is really important. Things like color contrast and using colors to convey maybe function are things that you want, or that's something in particular that you want to avoid. And any other relevant accessibility standards. What I'll say about this is, if you want to find out how to test some of this stuff, look for the sessions that we are doing with the AT3 Center on accessibility testing that are coming up over the next few months. That's where we'll dive more into this kind of thing. And the testing techniques and tools that apply to the web will apply to your embedded players as well. Just wanted to put it in your brains. If you're using something like YouTube, the YouTube embed is pretty good, and it improves with updates over time. It used to not be as good as going straight to YouTube, but it's pretty good. It's going to be the embedded players that are part of your web environment that you'll probably want to check out for accessibility. Because if you go to all of the effort to make sure that you have good captions, to make sure that you have maybe ASL interpretation recorded and it's all there and packaged up and ready to go, if someone then can't actually get to it and play it, then it's kind of not a waste, but you've put your reduced barrier content behind a bunch of barriers. So questions about the high level stuff before we move into a little bit of the how-to. Kate just makes a note in Zoom where if you spotlight more than one person during a screen share, it will default back to active speaker mode. For folks on the tablet, on the app. So they only do one person at a time. That's fair. I hadn't tested that. So let's talk a little bit about creating captions. I think we have a decent view of what we need to do to make video and audio more accessible. We'll talk a little bit about some of the tools and techniques that you can do to actually create them. So we'll start by focusing on the transcript, because again, that's the key part. You know, if you have a good transcript, there's some easier ways that you can turn that transcript into a caption file with all the timestamps and everything like we talked about before. So you've got a few different general approaches. You can do it yourself. You can send it all out to a third party. You can have an automatic service do it, or you can mix and match these. And somebody already talked about or typed about in the chat how they have combined automatic to get a source transcript and DIY cleanup. Go in and clean that up yourself in-house. So that's one good model that takes a couple of these approaches and combines them. With the do-it-yourself, there are a bunch of different tools available. Actually, I need to update the slide because Magpie is not available anymore. But you have tools like YouTube. And I think YouTube is something that a lot of people are, if not creating captions in directly, typing them in manually, then they're still using YouTube for some hybrid approaches. Online, you have products like CaptionTube, and you have proprietary installed solutions, Mac Caption and Caption Maker, and others. And I'm not endorsing any of these in particular, just making you aware that there is a suite of products, both free and paid, that will let you create captions by yourself. And what they do is they play the video with the audio, and they give you some quick to reach controls that make it easier to actually type the transcript, to type the text. So maybe you'll have a really easy shortcut command that will back the video up 10 seconds. And you can keep backing it up really easily and quickly until you get that 10 seconds of video typed into the product. The captioning products, one thing that's nice about them is, as you're typing the captions in, they're handling the time codes behind the screen, right? So as you're typing your captions in, it's connecting the typing, it's connecting the text to the playback track and timing in the video. So this does take time. There's no way around it. We, in a previous life, actually several years ago now, tried this, doing some captioning in-house, using some of these tools, and it was a lot of time. It was a lot of time, and we didn't have resources to allocate. So what we tried and had some decent success with was a technique that I've heard called revoicing, which is where you create your initial transcript using speech recognition. So something like Dragon Naturally Speaking that can learn your voice and build a voice profile for people, which makes then its ability to get everything right higher as time goes on. Now we have a lot of speech recognition built into operating systems, whether it's mobile, desktop, laptop. There are a lot of speech recognition solutions just built in. So the way that this works is I would play the video, and I would have a mic or a headset with a boom on it, whatever. And I would repeat what was being said in the video. So I'm listening and I'm speaking what I'm hearing at the same time. So it basically takes out the keyboard part, right? I'm not having to type at that point. Then you go in and clean things up. So it was much faster than typing, but it still took a fair amount of time. I won't lie. Where it was really helpful was I remember very few things specifically, but I remember this very specifically. We had a video that was about an hour-long recording of a panel with speakers who had very different voices, speech rates, accents, and the automated solutions, even now, aren't going to do very well with that. They had a lot of trouble trying to decipher between these. And you had one person whose speech pattern had a lot of long pauses, and the automatic stuff put a bunch of words in there in the silence. And then you had someone else who had a vocal cadence much faster even than mine, and it couldn't keep up. So that's what made us try this. So this is a technique. If you're doing something in-house, this can speed it up quite a bit, depending on the accuracy of the technology you're using, of course. Comment about Premiere, Camtasia that will run auto captions. And I'm going to talk about this kind of technique here in just a moment as well. But yes, a lot of the video production solutions and anymore, some of the web-based learning management systems that are used in K-12 or higher ed, they will create captions automatically. We see more and more solutions that integrate that. And the key thing to remember, I'll probably make this point again, but it bears repeating, is to go in and clean it up. You know, you use that as your starting place. That's the hybrid model, or one of the hybrid models that I think has become more popular, is use the automated solution to actually give you a first pass and capture most everything, and then go in and clean it up. So revoicing is helpful. It's quick compared to typing. It's more accurate compared to automated most of the time, especially if you're using, again, something like Dragon, or you're doing the speaking and can really make sure that you're clear, that you ensure that the acronyms are correct, etc. And it is pretty efficient. It's still labor intensive. You do still have cleanup. I never got to where I could speak things at a rate that kept it more efficient and quicker than doing it by typing on a keyboard. So I still had a little bit of cleanup. And if you're not familiar with or a frequent user of speech recognition software, then there's a little bit of a learning curve there. So I don't know just how popular that particular approach is anymore. And I'll get to that here in a moment. Outsourcing is a good thing to have at your disposal, not necessarily for everything, but looking across an organization, large or small, if you have a fair amount of audio or video content, then it may be part of your solution, if not all of it, to just send it out. Advantages of sending your captioning out to a service is that your turnaround and accuracy are generally going to be documented and guaranteed. I think a lot of the shops are turning things around at about a 48-hour turnaround for kind of their standard service. And the accuracy that they guarantee is at that 95, 99-ish% rate. And there's a possibility for volume discounts with most of the providers. This is something where if you're at the state level, you might look to see if your state has a statewide contract for captioning for the web. I know in Oklahoma, we just are getting through that process now to have some available at the state level. And the idea with that is that there's a high enough volume that the pricing comes down a fair amount. But it does cost. It is a paid service. And the rates I've seen, I know somebody said Rev is around $1.25 per playback minute. I think you go anywhere from there to almost $3 per minute. So there's quite a range. And we've done a little bit of comparing at AbleTech to try to figure out why that range exists in terms of the final product, in terms of, like I mentioned before, the privacy policy, things like that. And we're still kind of parsing that out, honestly, to see what makes one much better than the other. Again, there are other factors in there that you may want to consider. So then we have automatic captions. Already talked about that a fair amount. Some of the challenges that you have and things that can drive inaccuracy, can make it less accurate, are poor audio. And again, having multiple speakers, people's accents, sometimes the AI, well, the algorithm doesn't deal with accents very well. So what you're looking at is how much time does it cost us to repair this thing that comes out of the automated solution versus do we just start from scratch? And in my experience, there's not a set answer to that, because the time to repair will vary based on not just the organization, but who does it within the organization. So I do think that it makes a lot of sense to bring it in as a part of your portfolio for captioning. Again, just don't skip the repairing step. It's critical because you are going to find things that just really don't work, right? They just don't come through, and it takes away from the meaning that you're trying to get through. So YouTube, I'll show very briefly some things in the YouTube interface. I won't go through and do a full-on automatic captioning. YouTube creates captions automatically for basically any video you put out there. If you go onto YouTube and you go to, I don't know, a handful of videos from whoever, you're liable to find automatic captions. And that'll actually give you a pretty good inside view into the difficulties that those automatic captions provide, because you'll see some of the inaccuracies and some of the things where the technology struggles. But when you go in, you can use YouTube as your caption authoring environment. You can go in and type one by one, and the environment looks the same and works basically the same, whether you're fixing a caption track or building it from scratch. Laura just mentions looking at a DHS Department of Health update on COVID. Oh, so you were seeing it get the same thing wrong in different ways? Okay, yeah, so it would come across the same thing. She mentioned like Copacabana or Kobe Bryant. Names, they do struggle with names a lot of the time. Were coming up, and so what Laura was seeing was different mistakes on the same phrase or the same name. And that's really, really common. I think that's really, really common, and why it's so important to make sure that we don't rely on it, right? We don't rely strictly on the automatic stuff. So your hybrid approaches, we've talked a little bit about letting the automatic solution provide your transcript and then you edit. There are some that I think can save some money, but leave the transcription to someone else. In other words, you basically just partially outsource the work. You send it out and you can get a text transcript back from a third party. So remember, the transcript is just the text, speaker identification, things like that, but it doesn't have the timing. So you can take that transcript, you can upload it into YouTube, and you can say, hey, YouTube, sync this up. And YouTube does do a pretty good job when that's all it has to do. In other words, when it's not coming up with the words and the timing, it actually does a pretty good job. You can also sync this up manually. Now, you can use YouTube for that synchronization. You can use those third-party captioning tools. And basically, what I recall, the keyboard shortcut to set when a caption should appear and when it should disappear was the spacebar. So if you have a transcript and you import it into a platform like Caption Maker, you play the video back, and you're basically then just hitting the spacebar or whatever the keyboard shortcut is to set when a caption should start and stop. So much quicker. So again, if you save some money up front with the creation of the transcript and then handle the time stamping, it is a good way to get really, really accurate text and all the things that we need for accuracy, but handle the synchronization ourselves. That's an approach that I've seen people use to pretty good effect. So accuracy, I've talked about accuracy. It's the key consideration for captions. It's the difference between somebody actually consuming the message you're sending or not. But there are some ways to improve accuracy in your captions up front. One is work from a script. If you do anything scripted and you stick to the script, you have your transcript. Now, if it's like a Hollywood script that includes a lot of extra information, then it's going to be more than you need. But if you're scripting a training or a public service announcement, something like that, as long as the speaker sticks to the script, you have your transcript. You have the hardest part already done. So that's one approach. I know it doesn't work all the time, and it can be time consuming just to write that script. But if you are doing PR, if you're working with people who do those kinds of things and they have a video announcement, if that's scripted, then they might not realize it, but they have the hardest part already done. The transcript is already there. It's really helpful to send materials in advance, especially again for the niche kind of stuff. In the accessibility space, we spend a lot of time getting into very techie sorts of things. And so it's helpful to send that information to your human caption provider in advance. It will improve the accuracy of those acronyms and things that might not be just a part of our common shared language experience. If an automatic service is the way that you're approaching it, some of them rely on kind of a profile approach. In other words, it's not just Microsoft using all of its speech language processing to try to improve its speech recognition. Some of them will let you upload materials and will build out a vocabulary based on that. So very similar to when you send materials in advance for human captioning, it's just that you're sending it to a piece of software. In terms of improving just as you're going through your presentation, speak clearly. I know that, and this is a true story, I've got enough time. I was all but yelled at by a cart provider at an in-person event several years ago. But it was really good. What it made me do was focus on not talking so quickly. And if I do speak quickly, enunciating to try to make it more clear so that the caption provider wasn't struggling to understand what I was saying. So remember, if you're delivering content and if you're working with people to improve the quality of their captions, speaking clearly, using good recording equipment. You don't have to have a $500 mic, but a dedicated microphone goes a long way. Even if it's a $15 headset with a microphone boom, it's still going to capture sound more than likely better than your laptop or computer. And if you have a live event like this, use as good of a connection to the internet as you can get. Weather can break that. We all know that. There are things beyond our control, but if you can wire your connection, in other words, plug your machine in to an Ethernet cable instead of using the Wi-Fi, then that's going to do a better job of making sure that your internet connection doesn't bog down. And so then your audio isn't garbled. Actually, at the ATIA conference last week, there was a speaker whose connection was just struggling. And the captioner, typed a message to me. I was helping with the session and said, I just can't get enough audio to provide captions. And I said, well, I know, no one can hear, so it's the same. But that internet connection in the world that we're in now, especially, is really, really important. I'm sure all of us know that, and I'm sure that we've all been on both ends of that. I'm not going to go through these in a lot of detail. I've just got a couple of minutes left. Remember, with best practices, your captions are synchronized. Accuracy is super high. 1 to 2 lines shown at a time. Make sure the placement of the captions doesn't show or doesn't block important things in the video itself. Make sure that punctuation and mixed case are used. You're typing out words and phrases and sentences, so treat it like you're typing it in a paper or in a paragraph form. You want to try to break at natural pauses where you can, and what that means is try to not to end in between or in the middle of a sentence. This is one too that people often don't think about, but don't correct the grammar of the speaker. The idea is that you're shipping out through text exactly what's being spoken. And then include things that are relevant like music, sound effects, and speaker identification as well. A couple of overall things I mentioned: try to look for opportunities if you're purchasing from a third party to get a volume discount. You may prioritize media that you caption. You may certainly end up prioritizing media that you provide audio description for as a fiscal concern until you can hopefully build it into a budget over time, which is probably the best way to go for it organizationally. Let's take some steps. Let's not look at it as a problem that we need to solve all at once, even though we really do, but let's figure out practically how we can move forward. And remember that captions don't replace ASL. They don't replace sign interpretation. And one of the things that we've seen happen when litigation has struck a couple of times is folks actually just pull video down, or they shorten video. They say, well, if it has to be captioned, I'm not doing it at all. That's why I say start to take steps. Look at it as something that you plan for over time and build to from a physical perspective. So there's one question. Jamie, do we need to end right on time, or can I take a question?
I hate to tell you, but we really need to end right on time.
Okay, very good. Well, let's see. If you can just send me the chat, if I don't have it, then I can probably get back to people. I'll close there. I want to thank you all for your time today. Very much appreciate you paying attention to this. If you do have other questions, you can reach out to the AT3 Center, and they should be able to route them if they have anything to pass on. Yeah, great. Everybody have a fantastic rest of your day, and thank you again.